this. We need to talk about Prop 37 and why... I mean, it was important. It was important to try and change the rules. But the reason it fails is because the rules by which we change the rules are rigged. And of course, that's one of the ways that capitalism works is not just through coercion, but consent. The idea that we agree to certain kind of assumptions in the background around how exploitation should be normal and around how... there are a few myths in capitalism that do a lot of thinking for us. And some of those myths are alive and well, and they drive... they have driven this thing called the Green Revolution, and the Green Revolution is still alive and kicking. Now, the Green Revolution, if you're not familiar with it, the Green Revolution is not a kind of, organic hemp and tofu, sort of sandals and beard-driven kind of thing. It's not that kind of green. The idea of the Green Revolution was it was coined by a man called William Gowd, who was the United States Agency for International Development's administrator in 1968. And he had this idea that what the Green Revolution was not the white revolution of the Shah of Iran. And it wasn't the Red Revolution of the Soviets, and instead it was a Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution was a mixture of state subsidy and fertilizer and irrigation and philanthropy and coercion. And all of these things came together to make the Green Revolution. And behind this Green Revolution was a very sort of, there's a sort of myth about the Green Revolution involving a guy called Norman Borlaug. Has anyone heard of Norman Borlaug? Raise your hands if you have not heard of Norman Borlaug. Ah, quite a lot of you. Okay, so Norman Borlaug in 1970 won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he won it for being the guy who in the early 1940s left his job at DuPont as a plant breeder, and he left his pregnant wife and young child to go to Mexico to save the world by feeding it. And he went to Mexico and he bred this amazing variety of wheat that then, through the grace of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation and the US government, spread around the world. And because of the work that Norman Borlaug did and started, the world was able to feed itself, this amazing dwarf variety of wheat. And so the reason he won the Nobel Peace Prize is because by growing all this food, he provided plenty to the world and therefore generated peace. That's the story of Norman Borlaug. He's the kind of poster child for the Green Revolution. So does that become a little clearer, right? Norman Borlaug, this guy who is, it's not like the Nobel Peace Prize people have a good track record, particularly recently in picking winners. The European Union, Barack Obama, and back in the day, of course, who's the war criminal? Kissinger. There we are. Yeah. So Norman Borlaug, though, he's the guy. But it's interesting to unpick that. How is it that a guy who grows wheat makes peace? What's the logic there? Well, the logic is this, and it's an important logic because it's one that was alive then, is alive now, and does a lot of thinking for us. And the logic comes from a guy called Thomas Malthus, the world's first paid economist. Thomas Malthus, in the early 1800s, was the first economist with a paycheck, and he worked for the British East India Company. British East India Company, the largest single corporation that the world has ever known, responsible for, slavery, death, the usual. It's an incredibly powerful corporation that was responsible for stitching together markets in tea, in sugar, and responsible for colonization for a large part of the planet. Now, when he wasn't maximizing their profits, he had this idea that sits in the back of our minds and does a lot of thinking for us. And it's this idea, when people talk about Malthusianism, what they're talking about is the confluence of two different curves. The first curve is the food supply. And Thomas Malthus observed that every year food supply goes up by a little bit. And every year it just goes a little bit more. And so it's an arithmetic progression. So it increases by 200 tons a year, let's say. And so every year you just 200 tons, 200 tons. So it's a kind of straight line curve. But Thomas Malthus also observed that human beings do not increase by a fixed number every year. They increase by a geometric ratio. So families have 2.4 kids, or 5 kids, or 6 kids, and that curve looks more like a steep curve. So you have this line here. I'm not using PowerPoint, obviously. But that's because when people use PowerPoint, your IQ drops by 7 points. Did you know that? As a service to you. So, imagination. This is what we had before we had PowerPoint, was imagination. I'm relying on it now. Straight line here, curve at the bottom. Now, the interesting part is where they meet, over here. Because what happens when the population exceeds the food supply? That's the thing that Malthus was very worried about. And his answer was, there will be catastrophe. People will flock to the streets, there will be social upheaval, and things will go horribly wrong. So that's Thomas Malthus on population and change. And it's important because in the 1940s, that's exactly what policymakers in the United States were thinking. They were observing that, they were very scared that people would breed and they would outstrip the food supply. And then when this moment happened of population outstripping food supply, there would be catastrophe, and then they would go communist. Right? But this was a real fear. That people would, that there would be rioting, and then people would suddenly realize that capitalism wasn't doing it for them, and then communism would follow. And it's a really interesting reduction here. I mean, look at what it is that people have been transformed into. And always this is poor people, right? It's always poor people, people of color, people in the global south. And what poor people are reduced to are, well, firstly, sort of raging genitals. They're always all poor people shagging all the time. And so, there's sort of this population increase. And then, of course, the growling stomachs. So people are hungry. And then when the shagging and the growling stomachs just become too much, then the clenched fists. And that's, it's a very simple logic, but it's a logic that drove the sort of originators of the Green Revolution to come up with the idea that what we need to do to stop communism is to make more food available so that the price of food in urban areas goes down. That's the logic of the Green Revolution. Now you may think, well, that's crazy. Who would ever think that? The Arab Spring, I would remind you, the last thing that President Ben Ali did in Tunisia before he left, before he fled to Malta, the last thing he did was to drop the price of bread by 30%. Because his thinking was, look, the only reason they're angry is because they're hungry. And that's the only reason they want change, and as long as they're well fed, everything's going to be fine. Now this logic of the only way, first there's a lot of sort of crazy steps here. The first is more food implies reduced hunger. And of course, we live in a time now where we have more calories per person than ever before in human history. And that's a quote that I get from the head of Cargill, a guy called Greg Page, on the BBC, was saying, more calories than ever before in human history. He doesn't think that there's a shortage of food. Yet he is in the business of propounding the myth that what we need is more food to feed the hungry. But we have more calories than ever before in human history, and yet we have nearly 1 billion people who are starving. The problem is not a shortage of food. In this country, does anyone think, looking around this country, that there is a shortage of food? We do not. And yet there are 50 million people in this country who are food insecure. People who, at some point in the last year, did not know where their next meal was coming from. Nonetheless, this idea that more food equals the end of hunger is one that drove the Green Revolution. So Norman Borlaug was taken by the Rockefeller Foundation to Mexico in the early 1940s. Why Mexico? Why there? Why then? Well, it's interesting that before Borlaug and the Rockefeller Foundation were there, so in the 1930s in Mexico, the government had expropriated a range of things. They had redistributed land, and they had expropriated the Standard Oil Company. Now, those of you who don't know, the Standard Oil Company is where the Rockefellers got all their money. But there was a change in the politics of Mexico in the 1940s, and all of a sudden that corporatist sort of moment ended. And instead what you had was a banning of communists and a safer business environment. So Norman Borlaug was brought down in the early 1940s to grow food for the people. So what does he grow? Well, when you go to Mexico, tortillas, they are made of corn. And Norman Borlaug grows wheat. Now, this is strange, right? Because 10 times more corn is planted than wheat in Mexico when Norman Borlaug gets there. So why does he go for wheat? He goes for wheat because he believes that the kinds of technology that are required to grow wheat are going to be the kinds of things that only commercial farmers grow. So peasants are not going to be able to use this technology, and they're not going to be ready to understand the kinds of things he has to tell them. So he concentrates on the one thing, the one crop that is actually deeply irrelevant to poor campesino farmers in Mexico, and instead he goes for the commercial farmers, he goes for wheat. And in fact, the same thing happens when he goes to India, the land of rice and of wheat. What's the crop that he grows in India? It's corn. And again, totally irrelevant to most Indians, but there's this. The Green Revolution was not about feeding the poor in rural areas. Remember, it's about making cheap food available in urban areas. And you have this wave that sweeps the world, it demands state subsidy, that demands massive transformation of the way a government behaves. It also demands birth control. I mean, that's one of the things, if you're interested in this Malthusian idea, if you look at the transcripts in Congress, yes, of course, we're giving all this money to agricultural corporations like the Monsantos, but we're also giving money in large part, and the corporations that get named are the birth control corporations, the corporations that are out to stop people of colour having kids because the idea is that they are too stupid to be able to raise them. And I mean, there is this deeply racist line in the Green Revolution. And it doesn't take white people in the US Congress to implement that. In fact, in India, there's a class element here too, that it's about poor people breeding. So, and that's the problem. And so in India, the son of Indira Gandhi, the totalitarian prime minister who's now been sort of vivified and martyred, Sanjay Gandhi, in this period of emergency in which the Green Revolution was pushed. Right? Green Revolution requires violence, requires a state authoritarianism. In all the countries that are successful in the Green Revolution, there's always violence. So in the countries where this happens, and particularly in India, Sanjay Gandhi not only sort of implements the Green Revolution, but there's also forced sterilization as part of the Green Revolution process. So what's all that got to do with today? Well, these myths are still alive. They're not just the myths that Ben Ali has in Tunisia or now in Malta. These are ideas that the Gates Foundation are pushing. And the foundations that originally started the Green Revolution are, doing Green Revolution 2.0. And given the success that, the blue screen of death is fine when it's just on your computer screen, but you don't really want the blue screen of death in agriculture. And yet that's where we're heading, a very sort of technical understanding of how it is that we're going to feed the world, with genetically modified crops and with fertilizer-driven agriculture and with irrigation. And one of the countries that's adopted this is Malawi. And in southern Malawi, and this is the story I wanted to just quickly tell you, and then I'm going to end. I know I'm rambling, but this is such a good story, and this is part of the work that I'm doing right now on this documentary called Generation Food. I'll tell you more about that if you're interested. But the story is that in southern Malawi, they bought fertilizer and they bought they invested in agriculture, and the trouble was that in 2008 was when they bought all this fertilizer. Now you remember 2008. That was the year when the price of food went through the roof, right? What was the one the one agricultural commodity whose price rose the highest in 2008? Fertilizer. And so Malawi, an incredibly poor country, spends all its money on fertilizer, and it doesn't help that the then president bought a jet with the remaining foreign exchange. So they have a certain amount of foreign exchange that Malawi has. They get this foreign exchange by exporting tobacco. And so they have this bundle of foreign exchange. They spend most of it on fertilizer and the rest on a jet. So now there's nothing left in the country. So in fact, there's no petrol. There's no gasoline. There's no petrol. You should call it petrol. It's a much better word. So there's no petrol left in the country, and so there are riots. There are protests. This is actually one of the first Green Revolution protests. People take to the streets in anger because they can't get around town. They have to line up for ages for fuel. The price of food has gone up. There's all this fertilizer, but the harvest isn't in. So these are Green Revolution protests. But in northern Malawi, there's a different story. In northern Malawi, for various reasons, the fertilizer hasn't come, and instead they have they farm agroecologically. And they realize we need to change the rules of agriculture, and so and agroecologically means you intercrop, and so you have millet and you have cowpea, and then you have leguminous trees that provide shade cover that increase yields, and so you have this sort of incredible farming system that produces 15% more
food than conventional agriculture. 15% more than fertilizer-driven. I mean, it's an incredible farming system. And I present you with a problem then. You've got all this food in the field. How is it possible to have more food in the field and for infant malnutrition to go up? How do you have more food in the field and infant malnutrition goes up? How does that happen? No transportation. No, but this is in the field. People are walking there. It's fine. Other question. No, it's a good guess. Other guess. More food. It's there. And yet infant malnutrition goes up.
Yeah, it's not for them.
It's not for them. But no. Sometimes, for tobacco, for example, not for it's not for them. But this is millet and cowpea and sorghum.
Are they promoting formula over breast milk?
It would be in the city, but this isn't. This is in the rural areas. But a good guess.
Some sort of policy that keeps locals from accessing?
No, it's sometimes locals are prevented from accessing crops. Often, if they're for export, the policy would be you can only get this if you can buy it, for example. But this is stuff that is theirs. One last guess. Go on.
Soil.
Soil. No, in fact, this improves soil quality way above conventional agriculture. This is a way of building soil quality. The answer is that harvesting is women's work. And when harvesting is women's work, but also carrying water, fetching firewood, cooking meals, and breastfeeding. Now, if there's more to harvest, and you still have to cook, and you clean, and you carry water and get firewood, what's the one thing that goes? Breastfeeding. So that's how it's possible for there to be higher food in the fields, and for there to be increased infant malnutrition. So what do? Well, they figure, we need to understand that there's this unfair labour. We need to change the way that we think about that. We need deeper transformation. Don't just change the rules about farming, but address the problem of distribution. Address the thing that we never think about how distribution happens. We need to attack the problem in the home. And so they go around and like, well, clearly what we need to do is get men to cook. That'll solve everything. And it's like, well, okay, look,
if the problem is that there are these many duties and one of them is cooking, and maybe we can get men to do that. So they go around door to door, and they're like, women and men, we are. And these are Malawian farmers doing this experiment, the social experiment. Because all social change is an experiment. That's the joy of this book, by the way. It's a series of experiments that you can carry on and move forward. And so they're experimenting. And we'll go door to door. We'll try and teach people how to cook. We'll go for men. We'll teach them how to cook. So you go into the house. Hello, yes. Here's a saucepan. You may have seen one of these before. You put stuff in it, then the fire, and then you light that, and then you cook it. And then there's food that comes in the saucepan. It's amazing. And the men are like, oh yeah, no, I've seen people do that. Usually women. And then the crew leaves the home, and the men are like, well, fuck that. I'm never doing that. And that happens. So then how do they solve this problem? Well, they solve it. The farmers in these communities in northern Malawi came up with this fantastic idea called recipe days. And recipe days address a number of problems. First of all, you've got this millet and cowpea and sorghum, and people have no clue what that is. It's like kale. It's like, I've heard of kale. I understand it's very nutritious. What the bloody hell do I do with this? And so they have these recipe days are moments where people get together and exchange recipes. And what's also interesting is that it's a joyful experience, and it's also a space where men are encouraged and invited to cook and to exchange their recipes, and it becomes a prefigurative community. This idea of prefigurative community, it's a language from Christian literature about heaven on earth, about creating the kind of world that you want to persist. It comes from anarchists. It's been sort of used by anarchists as well. And this idea is that all of a sudden, what you're creating in this recipe day, where men are cooking and women are cooking, everyone is equal, and everyone is carrying water and bringing firewood and cooking together and exchanging, is a world of radical equality that you want to... This isn't a carnival. You're not just sort of doing it just, it's not a sort of cross-dressing experience for men. Although when men initially come in, they're like, oh, look at me, I'm cooking, I'm like a little girl. And there is that sort of weird, sort of uncomfortable shrugging off old rules and trying on new ones. But the joy of the space is that it becomes a radical space for suspending the old rules and coming up with new ones. And that gets to this idea of the rules by which we change rules. Now, it is important for us to have many ways of transforming rules, and this was important to try, but now we need to learn the lesson that actually capitalism is going to outmaneuver these kinds of efforts, but it's not going to outmaneuver sort of the kinds of transformations that changes who we are. The kinds of transformation that make us more radical, that make us more inclined towards equality, that make us more connected to our food system, that make us immune to the kinds of misinformation that they spread. But I think what's interesting about this Malawian experiment is also that it reminds us how change sticks. So it's not just a kind of one-off lesson where someone comes to your house and tells you the truth and moves away. It's about a way in which we together participate joyfully in making transformation happen. And that's a very different approach to making change, I think, than the campaign around Prop 37. It's a way to win Prop 37 by doing an end run around issues of equality and culture that capitalism thinks for us. And I think that's one of the that's a way of bringing it back to our food, our right. It's one of the joys of this book is that it is a way of experimenting with transformation. I mean, there's a wonderful lesson in agroecology that there are no recipes, only principles, and that every place is different, and every place where social transformation is tried, and everywhere where oppression is tackled, whether in the global south or the global north. It's not like we have a shortage of oppression in this country. That needs inspiration, and I have to say it was just a great honour to be able to see this in action through the book and through the work that you do, and it's just been a great honour to be able to talk with you, but also I encourage you all to buy this book, and for your friends and for your local library, because the more change we can, the more of this kind of change we can see, the more likely we're going to be able to win this kind of thing next time around. Thanks very much.
Okay.